IVM.
Hey guys, IVM podcast is turning 7. Can you believe it? It's been a pretty awesome journey for us with these wonderful folks, and I can't wait to see what the next 7 years bring.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. Today I have with me my colleague Ruturaj, and we are going to discuss about COVID vaccination trials in kids and teenagers. And before we begin, let me give our listeners a short introduction to our institution. So the Takshashila Institution is an independent, non-partisan think tank and a school of public policy. And we have education programs lasting 1 semester and 1 year that are tailored specifically for people like you. And they are all online, so you can take them from anywhere. So the admissions are now open for our 12-week graduate certificate programs in public policy, defense and foreign affairs, and technology and policy. So the last date for application, if you're looking for an early bird scholarship, is Saturday, 26th of March, 2022. And the last date for applications is Saturday, 30th of April, 2022. And the program starts from the 7th of May, 2022. So coming to our topic of discussion today for today's podcast. So Covovax recently got approved for trials in children. And, earlier also there have been vaccines that have been approved for kids. And the vaccination drive for the kids is currently in place. And there's news that Covovax might also be used as a booster. So when we get into the topic of vaccinations, especially vaccination in kids, right, Ruturaj? So what exactly makes Covovax different? We know that Covishield was approved. Correct me if I'm not wrong. Even Covaxin was approved, and the vaccination drive with these vaccinations have already been started. So what makes like this particular vaccine different from the ones that are already available in the market?
No, I wouldn't say that Covovax is very different than other vaccines that have already been approved for children. I would say it was like a logical conclusion that these vaccines were first getting approved for usage in adults, and then they applied for trials in different countries for children. Also within children, it was first teenagers, and then young and kids, and then even infants. So I would say Covax is yet another vaccine that has now got approval to act in India. But having said that, yes, it is, slightly different vaccine. It's not a mRNA vaccine as such. It's a spike protein vaccine. Now, what Covovax is actually the name of the NVX coronavirus vaccine that is being produced by Serum Institute of India. So just like the AstraZeneca vaccine was produced by Serum with a license, similarly, a vaccine developed by Novavax, which is a US-based company, is being produced by Serum Institute, and that is called Novavax. Now, it is, as I mentioned, a vaccine developed around a particular spike protein of the coronavirus, and the way it is cultured is slightly different. In the sense, the host for developing the particular spike protein are cell lines developed from moths as in butterflies and moths. So it's an animal cell line which is derived from moths. So it's an insect cell line, and that's where this protein is actually produced. But then first question is, how is the gene responsible for this particular spike protein introduced in this animal cell line, insect cell line? And that's done through a baculovirus. So first you take this virus, you clone a particular spike protein of the coronavirus into this baculovirus, infect your insect cell line with this, and the insect cell line will produce this particular spike protein, and then you isolate and concentrate the spike protein, and that is what the vaccine is. So it's not a complete organism or an attenuated virus, or it's not a mRNA, but it's just the spike protein. So that's how the Novavax or Covovax is. But otherwise, it is not unique, very unique or very spectacularly different from that. So we decided to start this discussion based on Novavax or Covovax because this was the earliest development. But otherwise, this topic of COVID vaccination for kids in particular, the discourse around this has been going on for over a year and a half, ever since vaccine development started all over the world. Yeah.
Yeah, so like I think when you were mentioning about how Covovax is different from the already existing vaccine, you did tell about the fact that vaccination for adults has always happened first and then the kids and everything. So, in general, all around the world, at least in India, we know that the vaccination drive started with frontline workers first, and then it went on to like the older people who had health problems and everything. And then it came to like, the above 18 years old, right? Since May 2021, they've been vaccinating people above 18 years old. And then, like, very fairly recently, I think from October or November or something, the vaccination for kids and school going kids was started and stuff.
So registration started end of 2021 for teenagers.
Yeah.
And I think the actual drive started in first week of January 2022.
Yeah. So in that way, so like all around the world, is it that pattern followed? Like in the sense, do the older people get vaccinated first and then comes to the younger teenagers?
Yes, that has been the pattern universally. Everyone started with either frontline workers or vulnerable older age groups, and then the age groups that were allowed to get access were, the scale was sliding downwards. So currently, if you see, US, almost all teenagers have gotten the permission. Now they have moved on to children between age 1 and 5. In China, also, trials took place with children and even infants, if I can use the word. So, yes, you see this pattern universally. And of course, nations which had access to vaccines first, they started vaccinating their children and their teenagers far earlier because they had covered their adults and adolescents way earlier. We have just started this year because, for whatever reasons, I wouldn't go into that. Our adult population, the size and the production took a bit of time. So now that has sort of been done, we are on to children. So one of the stats, this is a month, a slightly older stat in the sense it's from last month. It shows that around 70% of adults in India have at least got one dose, and 47% have got both the doses. So that's a good coverage considering our population. So now that we have achieved this, since 2 months, children are being vaccinated.
Right. So now when we're talking about vaccination in kids, right? Like I think from what I'd read very initially about COVID and stuff like that, it was said that kids don't necessarily catch the virus and stuff. So why exactly is it important to vaccinate the kids? Why can't you do it once they turn 18 or something like that?
Yeah, so it's still not very clear that why children didn't suffer that much. So it's not like children didn't contract coronavirus. They did contract, but somehow they were either asymptomatic or their symptoms were less severe. And death rate, fatality was very, very low in children. So I have certain US stats which say that 13% of all cases in US, all COVID cases till 2021, end of 2021, were children. So only 13%. Out of that, 3% actually needed hospitalization, while 0.21% resulted in deaths. So that's a very less percentage. When we contrast this with adult population, the picture was entirely different. Yeah. So just based, and this was also without the hard numbers, this was also evident for clinicians and frontline workers who were at the hospital. They could just see the people who were getting admitted in the first wave all over the world were mostly adults. So from the get-go, the adult population was prioritized. Then once when we sort of got hang of the virus after the first wave sort of subsided and it was sequenced, and I mean the conversation discourse started shifted towards development of vaccines, more studies took place. And what was actually observed, and I mean not observed, but a few theories were floated that why children are not that susceptible. Now these are theories, it's not exactly proved, but all of these theories could be true to a certain extent. And one of them is that children, when they are growing, especially, I mean, I'm talking about children below teenagers, when they are growing, they are exposed to a variety of coronavirus. And so strains. And so neutralizing antibodies are still present in their system. So they have natural immunity from their early childhood exposures already there. That could be a reason that children didn't suffer. The other possibility was certain studies have reported that the ACE2 receptors in the nasal passage, which are the gateway for this coronavirus to enter the human cells,
Yeah.
these receptors are less in number in children.
Okay.
So even if a child is exposed to some X units of virus, not all of them might enter. Like a very few of those will enter. So children might not have immunity, but the virus just simply can't enter into a child's system as efficiently as an adult. So these were some of the theories. Plus, the other thing was that a child is developing, right? So the immune
Yeah.
response is getting. I mean, it's still in its developmental phase, sort of, and it's far more active. So even if a child, let's disregard the first two conditions, even if a child is exposed to the full quota of virus, a child might be able to mount a successful defense on its own. And so all these things might have contributed to less fatalities in children. And that's why children all over the world were always the least priority when it at least came to vaccines against the coronavirus.
Right. Yeah, that is actually a very interesting point that you spoke about, right? I mean, in the sense that because a lot of adults were getting infected with COVID from the time COVID started, it made sense to prioritize people who sort of were at the higher risk of getting it. So, yeah. Before we continue, I would like to take a short break and we will be right back and continue this conversation forward.
Hey everybody, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On the Filter Coffee Podcast, Karthik speaks to three independent filmmakers, Guneet Monga, Sophia Paul, and Ashwin Iyer Tiwari. They dive into a conversation that is full of anecdotes, different visions, and films. Our new show, Voices for Water, hosted by Karthik Nagarajan, discusses India's Great Water Challenge. It examines the current state of availability of water in India and how we as citizens can do our bit to tackle this challenge. On the Pesa Vesa podcast, Anupam is joined by Binal Gandhi and Sonira Sangvi, co-authors of Piggy Bank to Portfolio, How to Raise Financially Smart Kids. They talk about the reason behind writing this book and their research findings with more than 500 parents. On the Edges and Sledges Cricket podcast, Ashwin and DJ talk about the untimely demise of cricket legend Shane Warne. They also cover the India vs Sri Lanka series. On the Life Manifesto, Serena highlights things she wishes that we were taught when we were younger, especially for women. And on All Things Policy, Megha talks to Arjun to discuss the recent tests conducted by the DRDO and how militaries around the world are embracing quantum. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you enjoyed this show or any of our shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Word of mouth really does help us. And also, please, a rating if you could. That is also extremely helpful to us. And remember, we're also on YouTube. You can check out ivmpodcast.com/YouTube to get a list of the different channels that we operate on YouTube. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, SBI Life Insurance, Bank of Baroda, India Water Portal, and Max Life Insurance. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Hello and welcome back to All Things Policy. And currently we were discussing about COVID vaccination in kids and teenagers. We did talk about how the new vaccine that recently got approved, Covovax, is a little different from the others, what essentially makes it different and what does not, as well as like what are the other countries that have vaccinated the children and what exactly are the conditions that has made like kids being prioritized now and stuff. So continuing with that conversation, another thing I wanted to ask you, Ruturaj, was that, so when we talk about trials in children, generally when it comes to trials, there's a lot of like challenges involved, especially when it comes to, as far as I know, I think one of the biggest challenge is getting an informed consent, right? Now, when you're an adult, it makes sense that somebody explains it to you and then it's completely on you whether to accept it or not. But when it comes to kids, there are parents involved, then there is you as a child itself, you do not understand the complications of it and everything. So that might be just one challenge we are talking about. So when we talk about trials in children, what are the different challenges that we have to go through and not just as parents, but also as kids and even as researchers who want to do trials on children?
Yeah, this is a very good question. So, indeed, there are quite a few challenges when it comes to conducting trials with children. This could be trials for anything, could be a drug, could be a procedure, could be a vaccine. Now, in this case, of course, the first thing that you mentioned that is very well present, very much present, that is the consent. So, a child can't give a consent because he is not legally, mature and has those privileges. So the parents have to be involved. So both the parents have to be involved. Yeah, of course, it is slightly challenging to convince the couple, convince the parents to enlist their child for this. So yeah, that is indeed one. So this is still a minor, I would say, because
Right.
you will have to reach out to more people. You have to be more convincing. You have to be far more open. So that, of course, is there. The second is, so certain studies, I mean, certain prior trials about other vaccines in general have led to something called as MISC. So this is multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children. Now, this is not related to just vaccines, but it is a condition where major organs of the body get inflamed, and then that's really too much for a child, and even the child might even lose his her life. And this can happen due to very bad case of infection, systemic infections. But when a vaccine is being developed, when you're giving particular bacteria or virus in any attenuated form or whatever form, the chances of this MISC is very high. So one has to be really careful. One has to think of the risk involved with any trial with this. And these risks were also present when it came to COVID vaccine trials. So, because as we talked, that children were not the priority because they were not being affected by COVID to that extent, they were not enrolled in the first instance. Plus, the other thing is, we alluded to this before, in the sense that children are developing. They are even in the teenagers till adolescent, their body is undergoing change. Then there's a case of puberty. Children might be going through puberty at different aspects. So there are huge changes that are happening, and the age bracket in children is very tricky to define, unlike an adult, where also these age brackets are artificially drawn. 25 to 45 is an artificial sort of number, but to come up with such broad age brackets is very difficult. So then one solution is to have very tiny age brackets, maybe 2 years or 3 years, but then that adds to the complexity of the trial. And then the data and let's say you sort of compromise and come up with 5 year age brackets, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, but then 10 to 15 you will have puberty, so that will be complicated.
Yeah.
15 to 20, again, it is teenagers and young
Right.
adults. So the data that is thrown up by these trials becomes challenging for a statistician or for a clinician to analyze and to draw any conclusion. So these are some of the trials. But having said this, people have gone ahead. I mean, countries have gone ahead with trials. So, for example, in US, for age group 5 to 11, again an artificial sort of a
Yeah.
age bracket, 5 years. The Pfizer vaccine was sort of has been cleared for, with trials taking place in this age group. The Pfizer vaccine again had separate trials for ages from 12 to 15, and 16 and older was also a age group that the Pfizer people came up with. So they seem to have, as I said, sort of compromised. They sort of came with a golden mean, 5 years age brackets. But if you see, let's say in China, they have gone as young as 3 years old for their Sino Corona vaccine and the BBIP Corona vaccine that the
Right.
Chinese have. And this vaccine has been cleared for everyone from 3 years to 17.
Okay.
So they actually have very young participants.
Right.
While
Right.
US did have younger participants, but as far as the data I have, there were no 3-year-old involved. The youngest was, I think so, 5 years. 5 to 11 was the youngest.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
if you see the number of participants, those numbers are on par with adult trials.
Right.
So for the 5 to 11-year-old age group, it was 4,600 children. Out of then, they also had some booster studies out for that. 1,305 were used, and the 663 were placebo in the booster trial. And then the other age group, 12 to 15, I'm talking about a particular US study. it was
Yeah.
2,200 individuals.
Okay.
And again, a booster trial was done for that 1,005 and 978 were the numbers. So
Right.
the numbers seem at par with adult trials. Only is that there are more age brackets,
Right.
and I have not seen this data, raw data, but I'm pretty sure I might think the standard deviation will be a bit high for this, and also the
Right.
response. And there, at least as per my research, it's not very extensive on this, but there have been no fatalities, at least
Right.
in children, like because there were certain fatalities and blood clots that were reported with
Adult.
AstraZeneca vaccine adults. At least in these trials that I have access to, there have been no fatality. So overall, we can say that the trials have been done in pretty much similar manner, and now these vaccines are out in the market and also part of government programs.
Right. Actually, that the point that you said, right, about like kids having various stages of development throughout, like from, I think, from the time they are born to till until like their late teenage and everything. That's it's a very important point when it comes to trials, right? And you also mentioned about how Pfizer had done trials in US and in China and like and stuff on the kids as well. So here, when we're talking about like, so Pfizer essentially has vaccinations for adults, right? Now, when we're talking about vaccination for kids, given the fact that the same company did do trials on the kids, how does the dosage sort of differ? Because I'm assuming since they are like smaller and and stuff, the dosage could potentially differ. So how would that go about?
Yes, there is difference in the doses, and even in adults. I mean, I'm not talking about vaccines here, but about other medications. The dose is sort of determined by your weight to a
Right,
certain extent, right? So something similar is also used in this case for vaccines. What Pfizer has done is their dose is actually three times. It's 10 micrograms for their 5 to 11-year-old patients or clients. I don't know what term to use here. While
right,
for
right.
other age,
Subjects. I think
other
subjects would be
subjects, yeah. So while for other children, older children and adults, the dose is 30 micrograms. Also, they are trying to use certain different needles which are smaller, but that's a secondary aspect. That's a delivery mechanism. But
yeah.
the dose itself is less. Yeah. So that is also considered when
Right.
children are being subjected to vaccines. Yes.
Right. So, like, now that we've discussed about vaccinations on young teenagers as well as young kids and stuff, right? Now, after this whole vaccination phase for all the adults is done, all the are done, but COVID is, from whatever I have read or from whatever people talk about, it seems like COVID is one of these things that is possibly going to stay for a long time, right? So in that case, do you see how sort of vaccination for kids could sort of go about in the future?
Yes, I mean, many theories and even past experiences show that this coronavirus strain will end up becoming milder, but
Yeah,
it will still be persistent in humans or in maybe
right,
even other animals, stuff like that. But we will have to learn to deal with it. So we might not have pandemics, but we might have local
epidemics and small
epidemics or local
bursts of
even
things.
just bursts, something like that. Or it could be just a few people might get it, but it could be fatal to them. So one scenario I can imagine is then COVID vaccines become like a mainstay. So just like we have a dozen vaccines for a newborn kid,
Right.
this could be one of the later ones, because as we mentioned, kids while developing, and especially infants, and they are exposed to coronavirus naturally, and they
Yeah, yeah.
might have this cross antibodies from cross immunity from other strains of coronavirus. So
Right, right.
maybe these vaccines might not be mandated for infants, but maybe after for a 5-year-old kid or a 8 to 10-year-old kid, maybe these vaccines might
Become the mandatory thing.
become mandatory through government schemes or something like that.
Good. Okay, okay.
But otherwise, as we have seen, because it's not fatal in children, at least these strains that we have encountered, there is no. I mean, there is need, but it's not as severe, not as urgent. But
Yeah,
if you want to eliminate maybe this virus completely, like we did for polio or smallpox,
yeah,
then
yeah.
maybe we need to think of it. And I can pretty much see it happening, or if not like a polio or hepatitis or the smallpox, maybe even like a regular flu shots,
True.
like many people take.
Yeah.
I mean,
And that seems very possible, right? Because at the end of the day, we want nobody to get it. We want to sort of deal with it before it ends up becoming the way it has been in like 2020 and 2021. So, I mean, starting probably if it becomes part of like a regular immunization thing in kids, then sort of you're eliminating the chance of them even getting it in the adult life or something like that.
Because there was one worry after the first wave is not after the first wave, rather after vaccines were produced and started being administered to adults, that because children are not going to be eligible for vaccines at least for a year or so, and most of the cases in children were asymptomatic. What if children become the reservoir of coronavirus? So the adults might be protected for a year or so, but once if there's a delay in a booster shot to these adults, the children, their own family or other children in their community might give it them back. So children might end up becoming a reservoir. So even let's say this theory is true and data backs this theory up, vaccination in children would also eliminate a potential.
And we've seen that vaccinations do work, right? Like the second wave was so bad for India. And then we could sort of argue that the third wave strain wasn't as deadly as the second one, as bad as Delta. But the fact that there was decent amount of population that was vaccinated against the virus sort of prevented the severity of cases and hospitalizations to a lot of people who did end up contracting the virus. If that's a assumption to make.
I guess we can say that. I mean, the vaccination drives and the decent coverage probably did contribute to some extent to the third wave being not that severe. So vaccines definitely do work. So I guess let's end this on a slightly positive note that vaccines do work.
That people who are not vaccinated, please do get vaccinated, get your vaccination done.
And not decent, but the right combination of science and policy can actually solve a problem. And I guess vaccines is a good example in the recent past.
Yes, that would definitely be it. Thank you so much, Ruturaj, for joining me and for having this beautiful conversation. Very informative, very well-rounded, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Priyal. Bye-bye.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Don't you think that if everyone around you is getting smart, you better be smarter? Hey there, I'm the traveling professor Siddharth Deshmukh, and I'm back with season 2 of my podcast to make you smarter. Smarter with Sid. What's this season's focus about? Well, it's about 10-minute nuggets that will make you stand out at work. It's time to go from smart to smarter. Tune in every Tuesday and Thursday and become smarter with Sid.
Habits? Routines? How exactly do they help us get better? Well, to simplify it for you, tune in to the Habit Coach podcast. I am Ashton Doctor, and I'm going to be here to help you get better daily with some simple, easy to do habits that you can easily adapt to your life. So tune in to the Habit Coach podcast from Monday to Friday, because I believe that awesome lives start with awesome habits.